Ladies and gentlemen, I am wearing a mask for this video because if I don't, apparently I'll be forfeited from being able to record the video. I'm joking, of course, but it turns out a very serious thing happened in round 7 of the Tata Steel Chess Super Tournament of 2022, and it felt like only yesterday that we were talking about it. That's because yesterday we were talking about it, but we've got something new to talk about here, and that is the game between Anish Giri against Dubov. And what happened is Dubov was asked to wear a mask while playing a game against Giri because there was found out after a special spy entered the camp that one of Dubov's team had been tested positive for COVID, one of the inner circle. And so they said, wear a mask or forfeit the game. And Dubov brought out his inner Novak Djokovic and said, I forfeit the game. I'm not going to play. And so he didn't show up to the game. And Giri got a nice free point, which I guess means he doesn't have any right to complain anymore the way he did after complaining about his play after being Caruana in that crazy game we saw the previous round. But okay, these jokes aside, I'm interested to know in the comments what would be your answer if you had been made to wear a mask but in order to play the game. Would you have played, or would you have played the Dubov gambit and forfeited the game? And it's funny, isn't it, how Dubov is coming up with opening novelties even away from chess moves. This Dubov gambit of refusing to play because you don't want to wear a mask on principle. I'll let you guys debate it because this video is meant to be mainly about the chess improvement, not the chess drama. Still, I thought I'd mention it given it's topical. And now that I've got you in, let's talk about the actual chess games. Starting with a game in the challenges, I'm not going to really cover the challenges that much because, Arjun Erigaisi drew with black against Rinat Jumabayev. Jumabayev had some chances but didn't take advantage of them, so the game ultimately was a draw. And so instead I'm going to show you a very short game played between two players who are, let's say, not really fighting for the first place, but because it's short you can kind of see exactly how to play the classical Sicilian as black, because why not? It was a game between Zhu Jiner, the Chinese female player, nearly 2,500, playing against the Belgian GM Daniel-Dardha. Actually, Dardha, I believe, his family's originally from Albania, but yeah, he is in Belgium. So knight c6 is the classical, and the rouser with bishop g5 is the main line. Otherwise, often black will go e5 and kind of get an improved knight off, where knight c6 is more useful than a6. Yes, yes. So bishop g5, e6. Queen d2. I think there was a game in the Tata Steel Challengers where someone played queen d3 in one that I saw, but anyway, queen e2 is the main line. a6. And the idea of a6, by the way, is to play bishop d7, but without your pawn on d6 getting murdered by knight db5, because that wouldn't be nice. The old main line is to go f4 and try to play an e5 break in some versions. In some lines, you're actually going to see a structure like this happen with b5, bishop f6 and gf6, where, yeah, you've got the doubled pawns, but you have the bishop pair, and, white's supposed to be somewhat better, but it's still a game of chess. The move f3, though, is kind of the more modern trend, and something, by the way, that I did recommend in my 2018 update to the Dismantling the Sicilian book. Nice repertoire for white. So after this, the main line now is to play knight d4, something that I did mention as being the strongest line in that book at the time, back when I was writing in late 2017. And it's funny because back then almost nobody was playing this, but after I wrote it, then suddenly Carlsen played it about a year later, then everyone else jumped on the bandwagon, and, well, it was nice to be ahead of my time in at least one way in my life. Of course, many others, but this is a good example. So I placed queen d2, just wanting to, get out of the way, I guess, maybe e5 or any other attacking moves. But it's a little bit weird compared to just playing king b1 and, biding your time a little bit. I mean, king b1 is almost always going to be a useful move to, get off the c-file or get out of the way of any capture a2 kind of thing. Anyway, game went queen e2, and I have to admit that white's playing this game is probably not that great, but it also shows very clearly what black is aiming for in these kind of positions. Queen c7 was played. You could debate whether it's the best move or whether it's better to go h6 or maybe b4. But queen c7 is definitely very thematic. A quick question for you guys. What would you play if they had played a move like bishop takes f6? Would you take with the pawn or with the bishop? You can make an argument for either move, but I actually like taking with the bishop better, just by a small amount. And it's not a very typical pawn sack for the classical Sicilian that, they can take and win the pawn. But after king e7, you actually get very good compensation. Because, I mean, your bishop is a lot better than their knight, right? And also, it's not that easy for them to use their extra pawn on the queen side. Don't worry, it's not me getting COVID. Just choke your own saliva, as it were. And I guess maybe white choked a little bit on her kingside pawn break. Because she played a move g4 at this point. And after b4, knight e2. So black just continuing with his kingside pawn storm. Well, kind of saying that, okay, you can do your pawn storm, but I'm not going to castle into your attack. Computer is totally fearless and says, I don't care, show me what you got. Because it wants to get the other rook in the attack. But, okay, a5 is sort of thematic in a sense. White probably should just go king b1 and, if needed, have the knight to defend the king side, but she went knight d4 instead. And after knight d4, yeah, black just continues with castles, realizing that, well, you wasted a tempo on knight d4, well, now your attack is a bit slower. If you play bishop e3, well, even if white does play bishop e3, I mean, you can go a4 and g5, knight h5 kind of puts a stop to the white attack, right? But if h5, you can even play moves like e5 and kind of hit back in the center and get actually somewhat similar play to what we'll see in the game. But anyway, the game saw knight b5. And black, of course, lobbed the knight off the board. Take. And now the move a4, just very strong move, just preparing to get at the white king. Because that's the whole point in the pawn storm, right? To be able to open the lines for our pieces and to create some weaknesses around the king, around the opponent's king, as it were. So white goes king b1 for lack of a better idea. Black plays a3, and if you play b3 as white, the problem is that black just goes d5, and this is just the dream break to achieve in the open Sicilian. If white takes and takes everything, the problem is you just have moves like queen e5 even at this position, and I mean, you either you're mating on this square, or they play c3 and you just kind of take, and white's king is just way too weak. Here you can really feel the difference in opposite colored bishops, right? That the white light squared bishop is virtually useless in defending the king, yes or yes. Now the game saw bishop e3 instead, but that's a horrible move to play because, yeah, your king is completely denuded. Queen b4, d5, the storm clouds are gathering around that white king, and after rook fp8, queen at e2. I can see it having this position as a puzzle, but there's really a million winning moves. But the most clinical is the move rook a2 played by Dardha. And white resigned because, let's say, after rook a2, if you were to take that rook with the king, simply queen a5 is force mate, yeah? If white goes king b2, I mean, rook b5 is of course completely winning, but even more clinical is to go bishop a3, not letting the king try to run away or something. Keeping a2 bishop to b4. And you're just going to get them with something like, let's say, king b2, bishop c3, and the queen will get in one way or the other to force the checkmate. So a very straightforward game, very clear example of what black is aiming for in the classical Sicilian. So I hope it gives you Sicilian players a little inspiration. Instead, we have some other games as well. I'm going to start with the win by Carlsen against Praggnanandhaa. Carlsen was playing with the black pieces, and this win did ultimately see Carlsen take the outright lead in the standings at the halfway point of the tournament. And his TC4 is a slightly unusual move order, but it's not actually all that stupid, because if white plays a move like e4, which seems like the obvious question of trying to punish the move order, after b5, a4, c6, it's really not obvious that white is better here. I mean, if knight c3, you have different moves after knight c3. You can play like b4, for example, and just kick the knight away and then defend your pawn. If they play moves like take, b3, I remember analyzing this, must be in a decade ago by now, but it turns out this b3 is not as effective as usual, because black go knight f6 and just take the pawn, or get the d5 outpost for the knight, and somehow black is just totally fine here. That's kind of an interesting bit of theory that not everyone kind of knows, but of course the players knew this because they're professional players. And Praggnanandhaa realizes the right move is just to go e3 and just kind of accept a transition normal queen's gambit. Okay, I guess queen a4 is also a move, but yeah, it leads to a different kind of play, as it were. Well, the game saw e3, a6. So Carlsen being a little bit funny with the move order, but after c5 it does transpose into a normal Queen's Gambit accepted, and if you have seen my I don't know what to play against d4 video, then definitely you will know that I mentioned there that d takes c5 is kind of the annoying line, where white just aims to trade queens and play for a very safe position, where either white wins or it's a draw. It's not very unlikely that black will win against a decent player, unless, you do some voodoo magic or something crazy. But the game saw b3, and this is the other kind of strategic approach for white, where white's going to try to argue that in a position like this, that, the white bishop is just a little bit more active than black's. It should still be close to equal, but white can claim some very small pull with this sort of pressure with the pieces. And it's low risk, right? So a decent choice against high-rate player to make a very solid draw, and maybe even outplay them if they overpress for the win. But Carlsen goes b6, wanting to keep a bit more tension in the position. It's not like dc5 doesn't make as much sense, I guess, in comparison, right? I suppose it's still a move, but it's not exactly critical. So Praggnanandhaa decides to go bishop a3, trying to fight for an advantage. After knight b7 and d5, again, very critical. And at the same time, even though white is kind of playing ambitiously and trying to, get some initiative in the center with this d5 break, I guess that Carlsen was also happy to see this, because now you have this imbalance in the structure. Well, in the game, black went rook b8, realizing that, take does give white a bit too much of a lead in development. After rook a7, bishop b2, suddenly, you can't develop your bishop and castle so easily, and that is a bit of a problem here. So black goes rook b8, realizing, he can always take at a later stage as appropriate. The game continued bishop b2, bishop e7, and it's one of these positions where, initially the engine gives white a small edge, but it kind of peters out a little bit if black plays it accurately. A move like b5 is apparently quite good, where that way you kind of just have ideas like going b4 at some moment to kick the knight away. Like, for example, they go queen c2, b4, suddenly like that knight, is actually needed to defend a bishop. And if they go e4, I guess you just castle and say that, you're just got a playable position, you've got a nice queenside majority to at least partly compensate for white's central majority, even if maybe rook e1 is still a tad better for white, but it's still a game and the position will continue. Black can also take and, get that imbalance with the bishops potentially for winning chances. So anyway, the game continued with castles instead. White now goes queen c2, and this is a little subtle difference with playing b5 a move later. You are giving white the time to play moves like rook a to d1 or rook f d1. And it's hard to say which rook is kind of better. Pragg decided to go rook f d1 to have this open file for this rook, or half open file technically. Maybe it's more precise to go rook a d1, so the rook can later go to e1 to support e4, e5. And I believe that white would actually have a very nice advantage here, though it is true he should play somewhat precisely. Apparently bishop e4 is a really nice idea in this position, where the idea is that if they take, you kind of got knight d5 ideas that give you a nice initiative. But otherwise, if your knight bishop kind of gets back to d3, you've got like knight g5 ideas to try to harass. And white does have some initiative in this position, even if it's only enough for a small advantage. There are also much sharper tries like knight g5 and going for stuff like f4 and try and rip open the king, but obviously it's very double-edged when you leave this weakness, but it could actually be very good for white as well, so maybe it gives even a bigger advantage. But that's something you can explore in your own time if you are so inclined. One thing also I forgot to mention earlier in the video is if you are enjoying this video, make sure to smash that like button, and definitely consider subscribing to the channel, as it's the easiest way for you to improve your chess. On that note, let's see how the game went and how Carlsen managed to take this currently equal position and turn it into a win. Now, h6 might actually be more precise just to deal with knight g5 in advance. But Carlsen went queen to c7 instead, which should also be quite decent, to be honest. Now, probably a move like rook a to c1 would be quite natural. Knight g5 is not quite as effective, when you don't have this f4, f5 supported by rook on f1. So that's why I like rook c1 just develop normally and let the position play as it may. Instead, Pragg goes a4, and I think that a4, while the idea of it is, of course, to try to activate the bishop, I think it's a slight positional mistake because, well, for one thing, you could even play a move like b4 and then take on d5. The point being that, this pawn could be a little bit of a weakness potentially, and yeah, in theory, c4 as a whole or an outpost for knight, but it's kind of like, so what? You've got so much played. I think black is actually doing quite well at this point. It's kind of funny to me the computer thinks that the best move is actually to sacrifice the exchange for positional compensation, but okay, that's admittedly a very deep point of playing on the light squares for the exchange. In any case, the game went h6 instead, which, yeah, I mean, it's sort of, so I say many times that Carlsen doesn't always play the best move, but he almost always plays a move that's like top 3 in the engine lines. So he doesn't make any like absolutely atrocious moves for the most part. So white plays queen e2. Moves like bishop a8 are only for the computers, putting the bishop on the back rank, as it were. I'm not even sure what the idea of the move is, other than to maybe test my gullibility. But anyway, the game went queen to e2. Black played queen b6, defending the pawn from the attack. We had e4, rook to e8. In general, it's a good idea to put the rook opposite the queen, right? Because you never know when some tactics will come up. Like, for example, e5 could now be met with bishop f8, and it's not so easy to, deal with the pressure on the pawn somehow. Though computer still says equal if you find this ridiculous bishop a8 move. I think the idea of it is to clear the way for some knight d5, but it's not like you're better after such a show of genius. Well, the game went queen d2, and yeah, somehow Prague just gets a little bit outplayed from around this point. Because after bishop f8, it's not that easy to actually deal with the pressure on the center. It shows that center can be a weakness as opposed to a strength. The game went queen to f4. Apparently rook e1 is a better defense, but anyway, queen f4 was played. b4, knight a4, and I'm not sure what exactly Prague missed. I guess positions were kind of difficult, but yeah, after knight d5, black does get the bishop pair, and apparently the best bet for white is to cut the losses and try to, take your chance in endgame with knight takes d7. I guess the hope is that after take, that at least if black tries to take e4, you get some sort of counterplay, at least like down here, but it should still be an extra pawn for black at the end of the day. So I guess I can understand why Prague wants to play rook d5 to at least not be outright down the pawn. But then e4 is kind of weak. It'll just take some out preparing bishop e7 without putting the knight on pre. So that's the idea of queen e6 to prepare bishop b7 like that. Apparently queen c6 is even better, but the difference is very small. Or actually, maybe the difference is not that small, in fact, because with a queen on c6, white wouldn't have the possibility of playing this move of knight takes c5, trying to, win a pawn, or, okay, win a pawn is not the right word, but to, play this tactic to, try to simplify. And okay, after knight c5, it's still not so easy, because, black is probably winning this e4 pawn. But it turns out somehow that with the opposite colored bishops and the pin being a bit annoying, that, white actually might have potentially enough compensation to save the draw, where a move like h3 is kind of sitting on the position. But again, this is not obvious in the heat of battle. It's something that is much easier to say when the engine is turned on, saying, yeah, you're up a pawn, but what are you going to do, Magnus? So after rook ad1, this is maybe a more natural looking move to develop the pieces, but unfortunately it just doesn't really work. Yeah, computer gives some very deep idea of playing c4, and I'm not even sure what the point is. I guess the point is that after bc4, there's some tactic on the knight, like rook a8, and somehow the knight doesn't have a good square to move, and somehow you can't really defend it very well as white. But Carlsen's way of rook a8 is a bit more human, saying, well, I'm going to play c4 next move and not have to, like, sack a pawn temporarily. And it is still winning, because, how are you defending queen e4, right? Because if you play queen e4 immediately, the problem, I believe, is that, yeah, white just takes and goes rook d7, and, well, wins 2 minor pieces for a rook. It's kind of funny that even with this sort of blunder, black is still much better, because these pieces are just so bad after c4, but yeah, why do this when you can have your cake and eat it as well? So queen c1, queen e4 is played, and, white is not in time to play rook d7 and grab the 2 minor pieces for a rook. Because after rook ad8, the problem is that after these rooks get swapped, look at these knight and a bishop and knight, they just completely lack coordination. Black's ready to play moves like queen e2 and rook d1 to penetrate, and, black's going to want and get the material back and just have complete domination with his coordination. Good or good. So the game went h3, rook a7, and now it's just a matter of mopping up. And in some moves, Carlsen was ultimately able to have a 1-0 score against Praggnanandhaa in classical chess. So knight queen g6, knight h4, queen e6. Just keeping the control, knight f5. White is trying to create some swinging chance against the king, but there's no real threat. Apparently, bishop b8 b7 is meant to be the most clinical, apparently, with some very deep idea that after take that you go this, Botez Gambit style queen sack with take bishop d5, and okay, it's very deep, but the point is that you go bishop here and you end up just winning a whole stack of material in the end. But okay, c4's playing game is also good enough to win, using the fact the pawn's a little overloaded. Apparently white has to play bishop g7 and kind of sack a piece, which actually just might have given white some swindling chances. It's maybe the reason why c4 might have been a little bit careless by Magnus, because after this and rook d6, I mean, white's got ideas like queen h6 after the queen moves, and yeah, it's probably not enough if black plays queen e7, but I mean, you've got to be a little bit careful. It's moves like rook d4, you probably have to go knight f8, and okay, black should consolidate, but it's not trivial at least. But in the game, white goes queen d4, and yeah, after knight f6, it just kind of becomes a dead end, right? Like queen a7, knight d5 is not really leading anywhere for white, but in the game after knight b6, black just went c3, just monster pass pawn. Knight c8, queen d5, so it's very well calculated by Carlsen, realizing that at the end of all the captures, and I lost count how many times I said captures, but you get the idea. Knight c3 and the pawn is ready to queen. And after rook b1, black just plays the move rook e2. Make sure the pawn is defended before playing knight c3. And given that knight d4 and, moving the knight back and forth doesn't really change anything, this is why Praggnanandhaa resigned in this position. So a very nice win by Carlsen, showing that the Queen's Gambit Accepted might have a slightly dry or drawish reputation, but, it can also be a little bit surprising that the opponent's not so well prepared for it. And in the game, Carlsen was able to unbalance the position and pull out the win. So on that note, let's look at another game from on the Masters. There were 4 decisive games in this Masters tournament. And, well, I'll do my best to get to all of them. The game report, Mamedyarov ended in a draw. Meaning that Mamedyarov ultimately kept the... actually, he got it to end up being outright second place because, well, report's half point behind him beforehand. And the other leader going in this round, Vidit actually lost his game with black against Jordan van Foreest in an IMSO, so let's see what happened there. Knight 6, c4, e6, and one good thing about doing a lot of YouTube videos is often, you've covered some line in the past, and so it allows me to relatively quickly skip past these opening moves and focus a bit more on the middle game battle, as it were. So this is all mainline theory, Kramnik variation, black... Interestingly enough, decided not to play the usual bishop a6 and try to get a quick c5 in. But instead he went for the less common bishop b7, which is not necessarily a mistake, but I always felt like white had slightly better chance for an advantage in these lines somehow. Then when the move knight e5, white is trying to disrupt black's usual knight d7 plan by maybe being able to go knight c6 or go f3, e4 ideas. So black goes queen d6, try and prepare c5. We have e3, c5. Obviously, white can't take that pawn because the knight is hanging, right? So white goes bishop f4 to defend the knight and threaten some knight g6 discoveries. So queen c7 gets out of the way. D takes c5. Rook c8. We don't want to take and have an isolated pawn, but better to take back of a piece if it is possible to keep the structure. Bishop e2 is played. Rook c5. And yeah, it's a point that black doesn't really want to take g2. Because that just opens up the g file for the attack on the king, right? Which is more important than being down the pawn. And here I think probably the most solid way to equalize might be just to play rook d5 and just keep harassing the queen, like queen b4, rook c5. And yeah, you are repeating moves in a sense, but what's a better move than queen d4? And just accepting the draw. I mean, if you go castles, knight d5, this is just very, very symmetrical, right? Queen d4, take... If ef4, knight c6 just hoovers off the pieces, and if queen e4, knight d7, again, just very symmetrical, and I think that it would basically just be a very simple draw in this case, just total equality. But instead of playing this and basically, the players, going for a quick draw in order to enjoy some of the lovely traditional Dutch ham and pea soup after the game, instead we had to move knight d5 in a bit of a longer struggle. White goes bishop g3. Okay, to be fair, probably this position is still fine for black if you play knight c6 and just, trade off the pieces. Because black's piece activity does kind of compensate for white's bishop pair. But at least there's an imbalance in the position where you can try to outplay the opponent, or, if black doesn't play precisely and you're able to consolidate, then the bishop pair are going to have their say on an open board. Which is probably why black should go rook e8 and e5 to maintain the balance and, try to nullify the bishop a bit. Anyway, the game continued f6, which unfortunately just doesn't work as well. Especially if white goes knight d3, this is quite an annoying attack on the rook, and it's like black goes e5, but you kind of say, so what? I've just got the bishop pair, and I've got a very nice kind of coordination of the pieces somehow, and yeah, just white is doing very well. Also moves like bishop g4 maybe can show up the light squared weakness, but anyway, the game went knight c4, and that allowed black to kind of get back into it. At least if he goes knight c6 and kicks the rook queen. I mean, it'd be very natural, just develop the pieces, complete your development, and then start thinking about moves like e5 or bishop a6 to be kind of annoying. Probably Vidit was nervous about b4, kind of trying to trap the rook. But then there are some very sharp lines like g5, where you end up like sacking some material, like knight db4. And okay, this is engine lines, of course, but the idea is that if bishop c4, queen b4, that you're actually getting back the exchange and not actually sacking material. So apparently white should go castles and like sack 2 pawns, but say that the black king is kind of exposed. Like, very, very unclear play. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if... Well, actually, probably Van Vries hadn't prepared it, but it kind of shows good imagination to see such an idea for white. But instead, black goes bishop a6 first. And white just plays b3, and we see one subtle difference with not playing knight c6 earlier, that you are giving white the move queen b2, which was played in the game. Still, after e5, position remains about equal. White's space kind of compensating and development compensating for white's bishop pair, because, well, the g3 bishop is a little bit stuck, right? So white goes rook d1. Knight a5 is a very good reply by black to, make some swaps happen. Castle's also a good move, so the players are playing very well here. Knight takes c4. Yeah, Machine wants to go queen e6 and keep the tension, but knight c4 is, I think, a playable continuation also. It does, have the advantage. You are giving white an isolated pawn to try to latch onto. And here, I mean, again, maybe f4 is the move to try to open up the bishops, but it is a bit double-edged to kind of weaken your structure, so I can sort of get why Van Vries didn't want to play this move, even though it's the engine's idea. I mean, queen b3, is also playable, I guess. Though it does maybe give black a move like knight e6 if he wants to try and hold back f4. Which could actually be a little bit annoying for white, to be honest, if you aren't able to get compensation for the isolate queenside pawns. But black went queen e6 instead, being maybe a little bit greedy. Going after the pawn. Because now white does have time to go f4, and it is what happened in the game. Still, ultimately, the play is about balance, but I think that f4 might be a little bit of an inaccuracy compared to maybe taking the pawn, for example. Because now your rook is getting a bit more active, and suddenly if you get rook to d6, you've got some decent initiative, let's say. Also, rook e8 probably is, I'd say, actually a quite serious mistake here. Where probably you should play rook c8 instead if you're going to put the rook on a square, to make sure that rook is defended, and so that, for example, you can meet rook d4 with knight e8, covering rook d6, but also keeping the pressure on the weak c4 pawn, and I believe that would keep white's edge to somewhat manageable proportions. Apparently the computer's saying you go queen c2 and sack a pawn, but yeah, it's a bit of a weird idea. Probably what he was nervous about was something like bishop g4. Maybe this is why he didn't play rook c8. But you just go f5, and yeah, it's just nothing. So anyway, the game saw rook e8, and actually white did miss another little opportunity, where here the move is not bishop f2, which kind of undoes all the... gives back the opportunity, but actually rook fd4. Just hit the knight, and... Well, I mean, if black has to defend the knight, it's clear that white got a very big initiative, yeah, but if you do take, and I'm guessing that this is what, he was nervous about, well, what if black just grabs a pawn? Well, it turns out you've got rook d8, king f7, and now you can actually just play a quiet move here with bishop d3. Okay, to be fair, rook d7 is also quite strong, or actually this rook to be precise. But bishop d3 is kind of the most effective, where you kind of keep this rook d7, bishop d6 ideas in reserve. But you also have ideas like bishop h7, or, if they were to... Well, if they play bishop c4, suddenly, your king is actually in kind of danger of, if not getting mated, at the very least, losing a ton of material in the process. Bishop f2 is also kind of a threat to skewer the rooks. And if you play something like 96, white just goes rook d7 and just wins back the pawn with interest. So, yeah, basically, or even bishop f2 winning the exchange for that matter. So rook fd4 is basically just a winning move. But white goes bishop f2 and the game goes on. Black goes queen f7. Again, play is more balanced now. Rook fd4. Again, a little surprised black didn't go knight e6, just activating the piece. And I remember in the Ganguly game as well, like I showed last time, that Ganguly didn't get his knight to the right square and it was stuck on a5 forever and it cost him the game. Maybe not quite the same situation, but yeah, bishop c8 is showing a little too much respect for rook d7. Because the general principle in these positions is that the penetration of the rook is actually not a big deal if you can just sort of swap the rook off right afterwards, and that does turn out to be the case here. So bishop c8, white activates the bishop with bishop g3. I guess rook da 96 is just kind of a swap in the end. But maybe not such a bad swap for white. We had 96, rook d5, keeping the tension, and yeah, black goes rook d5, which might seem anti-positional, but it's actually quite a good move here. Because after c5, knight c5, you are still getting that typical Nimzo blockade on the light squares, yeah? Queen c3. Black plays knight e4. I would probably just go bishop d7 and kind of just sit on the position. Because I think you have a fortress if you just kind of keep the knight on this outpost. But the game saw knight to e4 first. Queen e4, bishop d7. I guess it's still fine. But after bishop f4, trying to keep the bishop pair alive. The move g5 is a move that I think would be easy to criticize without the engine on as why black lost. But actually, it's quite a reasonable continuation, in fact. Because the bishop does struggle to find a good square. And it's not that easy to exploit the supposed weakness of the king. You could play a move like f5, for example, and just make sure your knight is anchored in with the pawn guarding the outpost. But king g7 was played in the game. Rook to f1 was a continuation. Queen e7, again, maybe a little bit imprecise compared to just sitting on the position with h6, for example. Because the difference with queen e7 now is that white is in a little annoying bishop move in bishop h5, where, suddenly black has to be a little bit careful. In fact, probably the only move is to play rook f8 to defend this pawn. And if they play d6, you go queen e5, kind of swap the queens and say that the ending is holding for black. The pawn might look annoying, but it is blockaded by the bishop and also can be guarded by the knight if needed. It's kind of a relevant point that black does have one more piece on the light squares than white does. Since obviously bishop on c7 can't compete on light squares, true or true. But the game instead saw rook c8. And now d6, I believe, is just very, very strong. Queen e6, bishop f3, and we see that black is going to kind of die on this square. Black, has to basically play knight to c5, because if you let something like this happen, queen e4, queen f6, or bishop e4, d7 is just game over, right? So black goes knight c5, but then bishop d5, and the whole framework just collapses for black. Allowing this would even be checkmate, but after queen e5, we just take, rook f7, king g6, and now Van Foreest found a very nice tactic to immediately end the game. Well done if you managed to find it as well. Perhaps you can put in the comments below to see if you got it right. So on move 42, Van Foreest played the move rook takes d7. The point being after knight d7 and bishop e6, we are winning 2 pieces for a rook with the pin. And frankly, you're probably even winning like the rook as well, actually, after something like this and, bishop move and d7, d8. So therefore, Vidit resigned in this position after bishop e6, to be clear. So a very nice game by Van Foreest. Of course, there were some mistakes. It was a bit up and down, back and forth, but it was sort of like oscillating between equality and better for white. And then when Vidit, probably in time pressure, played this rook c8, that gave the opening for white to win the game. And it shows you just how strong those bishops can be on a practical level as well. So next decisive game, as I remember to save this one. There was a draw between Esapenko and Shanklin at Taimanov. It's been a very interesting sort of theoretical discussion for the Taimanov in this event. It would make maybe an interesting opening survey at some point, but okay. I'm going to focus, of course, on the more decisive games. There was this game that was won between Duda and Caruana, actually, where Caruana bounced back from his loss against Giri the previous round, which, of course, is quite painful. But yeah, when you win with black next round, it makes it not as bad. And here, Duda played the London system. not sure if I'm going to go through this game in full, because we do have quite a few games to cover. Well, actually, to be fair, this actually is the last game, because the other day, the side game with Giri-Dubov I covered at the start with, with Dubov not attending the game at all, or not showing up because of not wanting to wear a mask. So I guess we can actually give this game its due. So we had Bishop E2. I mean, yeah, the D5, G6 up is not the most standard one, let's say. But, it's not so bad either. I mean, it is very solid for black to go just C5. And if I'm not mistaken, Caruana played this way against Kramnik a while back in the Shanklin Memorial. Just going E6, this is very flexible kind of double fianchetto setup. It is true, actually, that you could also play Knight H5 if you want to grab the bishop pair. But it does entail a bit of a weakening of the structure of, like, F6 or, Bishop G5 going for, some H6, H-G5 to win the bishop. So it does have its pros and cons, but computer thinks that this is just totally equal, apparently. Which maybe is the reason why moves like H3 are suggested by the machine to avoid the possibility. But in the game, Caruana decides not to go for Knight H5 anyway, and so I guess the semi-bluff kind of pays off in the end, because now, well, white is not limited, of course, to playing the move H3 at this point, but has some other options available. White availed the Knight E5 possibility in the game. One very interesting Alpha Zero style idea would be to play a move like H4, which might seem a little bit coffee house, but I mean, the idea of playing for this and H5 is a very decent one, I believe, and one that definitely could set some problems if black is not ready for it. Because normally against H4, you don't want to go B6, but you want to try and play a little more aggressively somehow. But anyway, the game saw the move Knight E5. And now Bishop A6 would be an interesting idea if you want to just trade off white's good bishop and play it very, very positionally. Your knight does end up a bit offside on A6, but you can bring it back in time. But instead we had Knight FD7 trying to challenge the knight this way. To which Duda went DH4, and we see that although it's a London, it actually gets quite sharp here. Bishop Knight D5 was played, so just general strategic principle or defensive principle of trading the pieces when they're trying to attack you. A move like H5 is the suggestion of the machine, and okay, from a human perspective, G4 looks like a very scary idea at some point. But if white does play G4 in response, it's actually not that simple. You have to take. Yeah, it looks scary to deal with H5, but you also can kind of open up the center a little bit. For example, you go Knight to C6 hitting the bishop, and, if they trade the bishops, then you're ready to go E5 and hit in the center. Or if they do play H5, you've got moves like Rook H8 to kind of deal with the H-file play. So, I mean, you can neutralize this, in general, you're doing fine. Okay, apparently it's even better to go CD4 and E5, but still, Rook H8 is kind of thematic as a worst-case move to neutralize the ideas. Anyway, the game saw Knight C6, which, I mean, it's not a move I think is as flexible as Knight D7 and bring Knight to F6 for defense if you want to trade the bishops. I think Knight D7 is maybe the better way to do so, is my feeling. But the game saw Knight C6, and now I think white does actually have a little bit of an initiative to work with. Granted, it's not that easy to bring the queen into the attack like to H6, but your position is very solid. You're attacking a very solid foundation, right? Black plays move Queen E6, which I think is a very good defense by Caruana, to maybe be able to bring the queen into defense in some lines. And here I think this is a kind of important position for the comparison technique. Now, this idea did occur to me before the computer suggested at this moment, but let's test your attacking flair and see if you're able to find the right move here with white to play. Now, the idea did actually occur to Duda in the game, because at this point he did play the move Queen A4, trying to get his queen to H4 for the H-file attack. Although in that case, black is able to play CD4, and at least, you managed to excommunicate the queen away from the king side, right? And we will see this in the game, but the better move order, and the one that I would have gone for, at least, would be to play DC5, which I get looks a bit anti-positional, but it's more important that you kind of keep that momentum going and keep that initiative. Yeah, the center looks nice, but white can play around it, yeah? And also, if black does go Rook B8, you can castle long, and, you've got a very nice activity of the pieces to compensate for not having that bulwark on D4 of space. Say if Queen F6 trying to cover Queen H4, I mean, you have a few different options here as white, actually. You could play a move like Knight F3, just kind of build up. You could play a more ambitious move like F4. It's also interesting to play a move like H6 at some point, even just not going for the mating attack, but just to, have the fawn pawn kind of in the long term. As I think about it more, or I guess more precisely as Stockfish thinks about it more, it's very hard to say. They're all very interesting options, but I think I'm leaning more towards f4. Just as well, you kind of take some space. You can try to go g4, g5 in some lines. It seems like the most ambitious move at the very least for white. But anyway, the game continued queen a4, and well, now I feel like it's not as bad for black by comparison, right? I mean, you're not coming under that big of an attack. Or a move like bishop d7, you could definitely think about, for instance, trying to get in b5, b4, and getting that minority attack going on the queen side, yeah? But black goes bishop f5 in the game, which is slightly imprecise, actually, because after a very nice maneuver by Duda, knight f1, what happens is black is basically going to be a tempo down compared to the bishop d7 lines, because, well, after g5, knight e3, we see that the knight is attacking the bishop, and with the bishop going to d7 anyway, it means white just gained a full tempo with this maneuver, and it might encourage you to see that even the world's top players sometimes get the comparison method a little bit off. First, due to we're not seeing the difference of dc5, bc5, and Caruana of not appreciating the difference between bishop f5 and bishop d7. So master this and you could be the best player in the world. In any case, the game went h6. Very nice move by Duda, and at this point, white does have a very serious advantage, but somehow, Duda does go a little bit astray. Like queen b3, for example, I feel like you kind of want to play e6 in some ways as black anyway, because just to make your structure more solid. Whereas I think that a move like castles long would be much more to the point, and I get that, you're worried about some rook b8, b5, b4 attack, but I mean, I don't think it's that scary in reality. Like after rook b8, for example, that's not the engine's first line, but kind of a human move. You could even go bishop b5 and just really make it hard for black to get in a6 and b5. And, if they play a6 and try to do it this way instead, well, now you have queen b3 and you're actually just grabbing a pawn. So you see that tactically there are some problems for black to get things moving. Whereas if you give white time, you can go for moves like f4, rip open the king side, and I mean, Bob's your uncle after that. Well, the game saw queen b3, e6. And again, I think, rook d1 is, I think, not quite to the point in the way that castles long is, because keeping the king in the center is kind of a lot riskier, I think, than castling long with the rooks disconnected. It means if black does have some way to open the position later, it could very well turn the game around. A move like f5 is actually very interesting, where you prepare stuff like knight e7 and try to get some counterplay on the king side in some ways. Probably already white has to play some move like c4 and really change the position quite a lot in order to avoid coming under a little pressure. And I mean, the position would be probably close to equal, but definitely one where both sides' kings could become quite exposed depending on the next moves. Rook a8 was Caruana's choice, which, I mean, is also fine here. And then after queen c2, which probably is not as precise as, say, queen a4 and admitting the mistake. Now f5, and suddenly black is getting some quite real counterplay. He's got the space on this side, and white is not really finding a great pawn break yet, which is really quite an important thing in the London more close side position, to have some pawn break to open the pieces, true or true. So the game went c4. This is a nice move, trying to pressure the center. Black keeps attention in knight e7, also reminding white it is good to have our rook opposite the opponent's queen. Queen c3, nice move, trying to get some c5 kind of cheapos in. But knight g6 kind of deals with it, because if white does play c5, and to be fair, probably c5 is the right move, trying to get the pawns moving, but okay, queen e7, I mean, is just a position. Game goes on, b4, queen f6, I mean, there are chances for both sides. White definitely has some ideas to try to be annoying on the queen side, but black also has some real potential to be a bit of a pain on the king side. So, chance for both sides is a fair assessment here. Engine, of course, gives 0, 0, 0, because that's what it says to everything. But the game went b3 instead. And, I mean, it gave white black ideas like knight f4 at some point, and also queen e7 is in the game is pretty decent. And actually, it appeared to be probably a strategically, or let's say practically interesting decision to kind of try to tempt white in a g3 at this point. Because, you could sort of debate whether it actually makes things worse in a way, in the long term. Because if we imagine, let's say, a move like queen f6, f4 maybe isn't a threat yet because of knight g4 attacking the queen, but we could definitely imagine some situation, say bishop c6, where, this is under fire. And if you do, let's say, play rook h2, well, your king can't castle, but on average, you don't really want to castle either, because you've got, like, knight e7, and then the pawn is just lost. Okay, computer, of course, shows off and points out knight f4 is a genius piece sack to win the game. But anyway, you get the idea. The h6 pawn is the fawn in. It's kind of, it was a fawn pawn before, but now it's white who is going to be suffering greatly. So queen f6 would be a nice move. And okay, Caruana goes bishop c6 first, which is, I think, just as good a move order. Maybe it gives white option to castle, but I don't totally buy it. White went rook h5 in the game, trying to keep his pawn defended. Queen f6, rook d2, and yeah, somehow black's piece just coordinate a lot better, because you can see here that, this rook, it defends, but it doesn't really harmonize with white's other pieces in the center, right? Like, for example, if white wanted to play c5, you really wish you had rook on c1 instead, for example. But yeah, as it was, white was a little bit overextended, and granted there are maybe moves like queen to b2 and kind of sitting on the position and maybe keep the disadvantage to a minimum. But it's also, like, psychologically a difficult decision just to sit and move back and forth and hope that you have some fortress, right? But apparently, something like this is probably the best plan. If you could get the king to a1, at least your king is a bit safer there, right? But the game saw knight c2, and yeah, now this actually is probably a decisive mistake because of Caruana's next move. He understood that, well, the problem with f4 earlier was knight g4, but here you can just play f4 directly because now you stop knight e3 and from there knight g4. And yeah, subsequently, white's king is just too exposed. The lack of coordination and the weak pawns really cost him dearly. The game ultimately concluded king d1. Bishop e8 was played. I like knight f5 better just to hit the pawn and maybe keep your bishop e8 idea in reserve. Or even play dc4 and activate the bishop that way, for instance. But okay, to be fair, bishop e8 I don't think totally spoils anything either. Still, black is much, much better. Rook h3. Apparently rook h1 is a little bit safer, but anyway, the game saw bishop g6. So okay, it probably plays a little bit low on time, and this is why they're not playing like absolute top engine move, but it doesn't overly affect the assessment in all fairness. Knight e1, yeah, probably not the best defense. Like bishop d3, it's not an easy move to play, but probably it's what has to be done. Try to at least trade off some of these very good pieces. Yeah, knight f5 is, this maneuver would be a really cool one to be able to play if possible. Because if they were to play like f3, the knight would kind of go back and into e3, so you just kind of use white's weaknesses with the pawn structure against him in a way. Still, bishop f5, also a perfectly good move. You kick the rook to a square, and then, you take, b5. Very nice transformation of the structure by Caruana, because if you get this in, you're just killing him on the c-file. But after c5, knight d5, we see that the knight is on a beautiful outpost on d5. Queen b2, b4, even more beautiful outpost on c3. Bishop d3 was played, and yeah, a5 is kind of a typical, like, consolidating move in time trouble. A computer, of course, points out that a5 actually kind of loses the momentum, and that actually the move e5 is actually the move that is called for. Okay, e5 maybe is a little bit computerish, like, you have to figure out, like, d5, that, knight c3, that you have, like, this attack, and, that they can't just take, or they kind of lose an exchange after all attack captures. Okay, it's not super hard to calculate, but if you have no time on the clock, it's hard to even consider the possibility of such a move. And to be fair, the ending, is... Well, okay, the ending should be winning. You are going to pick off the pawns one way or another, so yeah, it should just be a win. But I guess you could also play, like, knight c3 or rook fd8 and knight c3, and, that would also be a maybe simpler way to go after the pawn and convert the advantage. Well, the game saw a5, and yeah, now after king c1, white actually is kind of back in it, because knight c3 isn't coming with a check anymore, and gives white time to go knight f3, and at least consolidate the position to some extent. But of course, when you're under sort of pressure for a while, it makes it hard to keep up the good moves, and well, queen c2 was played in the game. Funny enough, actually, rook fd8 might be a mistake, because if white goes bishop f5, suddenly the black king is actually a little bit exposed. If white get in some... I don't know, queen b3, the black king is not so safe all of a sudden, and this pawn is kind of weaker than this pawn, so yeah, it's not so clear that black is actually kind of equalizing it all here. But the game saw queen c2, and then it's kind of more in the balance, take. Rook d5 was a move to make the time control. And yeah, at this point it actually would be kind of interesting just to play a move like rook c3 and kind of sacrifice the exchange on the one hand. But on the other hand, after a move like queen e4 and knight e5, it's suddenly, the black king is not so safe. White's got some quite real threats, and It's certainly a position I could see very much turning in white's favour quite fast if black doesn't defend very accurately. You know, computer says equal, but I think that anyone would prefer to be white in this sort of position based on the initiative that white has. But the game saw knight e5 instead, and yeah, unfortunately this just runs in knight b5, and okay. Apparently you can still play the move queen b2, and you're still holding apparently in some engine-like idea with like take. Because at first the engine says black is just much better, but then it turns out because of that pawn on h6 once again, and this is sort of the sub-theme of the game if you like. Well, then it turns out that white can even play moves like rook takes f4 and, you know, try to get a pawn back. Or for that matter, even a move like rook hd1, king g8. Just to, you know, get out of the way of rook d8 check ideas. And then also, you know, even rook f4, like this is a really nice tactic. It's not so easy to see from afar, but, you know, going for a queen g7 mate, or, you know, if the queens do get traded, like white clearly has very good counterplay against a white king that, you know, realistically I think should be enough for white to hold the draw. Like, black's checks don't really lead to mate when the king can kind of run, right? So anyway, the game went rook hd1 instead, and this was, let's say, the decisive mistake, as now the difference is after take, black has this move rook c takes c5, which, you know, didn't really make sense when the king was on b1, but now the important point is, yeah, rook c1 for queen e5 is obviously nothing, and if you play the move of... actually, I should explain why. It's because after rook d5, you've got this very important move of queen a1. Like, without that check, it would be white who's winning with the back rank. But this allows you to play rook d5 with check, and yeah, your attack is immediately going to be a lot faster than white's, because you're giving the checks before they can give the mate. So after rook d5, this is what white played in the game, but rook c2 comes with a check, and ultimately white is not able to get his piece around to actually win to checkmate the king, because after king g8 now, this is a real threat to take the pawn. And after rook takes a5, well, actually, maybe it's not so true, because actually after queen h6, this might be some study-like draw. Because after rook a8, you know, you don't have king f6 because of knight g4, right? But here, white can probably just keep checking, in fact, and sort of use this beautiful point at king d8 or king d6 running a knight to f7. Obviously, king e6 just runs into rook a6, so it just ends up being a draw. So a very tricky move, actually, rook takes a5. But black does have a narrow path to a win, and it's with the move queen f5, just continuing to give the checks with a tempo, queen to b1, running the king up the board, king c4, queen e4. And it turns out that, yeah, after queen e4, you're also covering the square, which affords black the time to even play a move like f3. Though, to be fair, king f8 would also be winning here. And I mean, white's just not able to keep that king boxed in, is the problem. So after knight c4, black played queen to b1, king a4. Because knight b2 is just horribly passive, right? But after king a4 take, king b5 and b3, well, white resigned, because, yeah, if you take the queen, a new one will soon take its place, but otherwise, you know, you just collect the pawns and black wins easily. So, a very fun game with Caruana being able to outplay actually from a worse position against Duda, where Duda tried to be a little bit too creative, didn't manage to coordinate the pieces, and it allowed Caruana to pull out the win in very nice fashion. So a game with a lot of mistakes, but a lot of instructional points to it as well, right? And then with that pretty much concludes my round 7 recap. I mean, if I were to cover all the other challenges games were decisive as well, yeah, we would be here for quite a long time, because there were, let's say, 3 other decisive games, as I showed at the start of this recap. Or actually, no, there were 4 other decisive games. Wow, that is a really large number. So yeah, basically to just give you a recap of the standings after round 7. In the challenges, Eragazi is still leading, but this time with 6 out of 7, and his lead, I believe, has been cut to 1 point, because yeah, Taidai Van Nguyen won against Marc-Andrea Morizzi, so Nguyen is now in 2nd place, a point behind Eragazi in the challenges. Whereas for the Masters, Carlsen, with his win against Prague, ended up taking outright lead on 5 points, with Mamedyarov outright second on 4.5, and a few players on 4 points to, you know, not so far behind. So definitely an exciting round coming up for round 8, and it was cool to be able to get this video done a little bit faster than usual as well. So do let me know in the comments below what was your favourite game out of the ones I showed you here. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care.